You know, after 40 years sitting on this bench, I've learned to recognize the sound of trouble before it ever speaks. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just hangs in the air like a storm you can smell before you see the clouds. And that morning, when I walked into my courtroom at 8:15 sharp, like I have since 1984, I felt something different. I didn't know what it was yet. But I knew the day wasn't going to end quietly. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a judge in Providence for 40 years. Every morning I park in the same spot. I walk up the same stone steps. I nod to the same security officer who's been there almost as long as I have. Routine matters to me. It keeps my mind steady. Christina, my clerk, always beats me into chambers by 10 minutes. I could smell the coffee she brought me before I even opened my door. Strong, black, exactly the way I've taken it for decades. She knows I don't like sugar. She says I'm stubborn. I tell her I'm consistent. My father used to tell me something when I was a boy growing up here in Providence. He said, "Frank, never let power change how you treat people." He came to this country from Italy with nothing but 2 hands and a belief that America was fair. He worked construction until his knuckles were thick and scarred. He believed the law was sacred. I carry that with me every day. I've seen every kind of person sit in front of me. Millionaires, single mothers, teenagers who made stupid mistakes, veterans who carried invisible wounds. I've learned one thing in 40 years. The law doesn't care about your last name. It cares about your choices. That particular morning, I remember adjusting my robe and thinking about my grandson. He had just turned 12 the week before. Watching him grow up reminds me why this work matters. What kind of world are we building for kids like him? I stepped onto the bench and looked out at my courtroom. The wooden pews were filling up, some faces nervous, some angry, some embarrassed. I could hear papers shuffling. I could feel that low hum of anxiety that always sits just beneath the surface. And then I noticed something. In the back row, leaning back like he was at a movie theater instead of a courtroom, sat a young man with his arms crossed, expensive jacket, perfect haircut, phone in his hand. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't respectful. He was bored. I remember thinking to myself, that's not someone who's afraid of consequences. But I didn't focus on him yet. I had cases to call. The first case of the morning was an elderly veteran named Mr. Donnelly. I watched him walk slowly toward the podium with the help of a cane. His back was slightly bent. His hands trembled just a little. I felt my chest tighten. I said to him gently, "Good morning, sir. Take your time." He looked up at me and nodded. His voice was soft. He had received a citation for a broken tail light. He explained that he lived on a fixed income. He had served 2 tours overseas. His wife had passed the year before. As he spoke, I watched the courtroom. I saw people shift in their seats. I saw a few heads lower. Respect was filling the room. I leaned forward and said to him, "Sir, you served this country. The least we can do is show you respect in return." I dismissed his fine and asked the officer to make sure his tail light was fixed safely. I saw tears form in his eyes. Moments like that are why I still wear this robe. Now let me pause here for a second and ask you something. Have you ever seen someone who earned your respect the moment they opened their mouth? Someone whose humility spoke louder than any title? Leave me a comment and tell me about that person. I read every single one. As Mr. Donnelly walked back to his seat, I heard something, a short laugh, not loud, but sharp. It came from the back row. I didn't turn immediately. I've learned patience over the years, but I felt the energy shift. It was subtle, but it was there. Disrespect spreads faster than kindness if you let it. Christina called the next case. a young woman who had missed a parking meter while rushing her child to daycare. She was nervous. She apologized before I even asked her anything. And while she spoke, I saw him again, the young man in the back. He was scrolling on his phone, smirking, whispering something to the man beside him. He wasn't just uninterested, he was amused. That told me something. He didn't believe he belonged there. I felt my father's voice in the back of my mind. Frank, watch how a man behaves when he thinks no one can touch him. I've learned that arrogance has a look. It's in the posture, the half smile, the way someone avoids eye contact because they don't think they owe it to you. By 9:10, I had cleared 3 cases, each one different, each one human. And that's when Christina quietly placed a file on top of my stack. She didn't say anything, but she looked at me. I glanced down at the name. I recognized the last name immediately. I won't pretend I didn't. Providence isn't a huge city. When you've been on the bench for 40 years, you know the families. You know the reputations. I looked back toward the gallery. The young man finally looked up at me. And this time, he held my gaze. Not with respect, with challenge. I remember thinking, this isn't going to be a simple hearing. I adjusted my glasses. I took a slow sip of coffee that had gone slightly cold. I set the cup down carefully. I've always believed something simple. In my courtroom, a nurse and a millionaire stand on exactly the same ground, and that's how it should be. But sometimes someone walks in believing the ground belongs to them. And that morning I had the strong feeling I was about to meet someone who had never once been told no. I didn't know yet how far this would go. I didn't know voices would rise. I didn't know I would stand from this bench in a way I rarely do. But I could feel it building, like pressure before thunder. I looked at Christina and gave her a slight nod. She called the name, and when that young man stood up from the back row, slow and confident, adjusting his expensive watch as he walked forward, I felt the entire courtroom shift its attention. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't apologetic. He walked like he owned the building. And as he approached the podium, I looked him directly in the eyes for the first time. What I saw there wasn't fear, it was entitlement, and that, in my experience, is far more dangerous. He stopped at the podium like he was stepping onto a stage instead of into a courtroom. I watched him slide his phone into his pocket slowly, almost casually, like he was doing me a favor. He didn't bow his head. He didn't say good morning. He just stood there, chin slightly raised, waiting for me to begin. I looked down at the file again, then back at him. I said, keeping my voice steady, "Good morning. State your name for the record." He sighed before answering, actually sighed. I heard it clearly in the silence of my courtroom. Then he said his name in a flat tone, like this was beneath him. I had to pause for a second, not because I was confused, but because I was measuring him. I've learned to do that over the years. Some people need firmness, some need patience, some need mercy, and some need a mirror. I said, "You're charged with reckless driving, excessive speeding, and failure to comply with an officer's instructions. Is that correct?" He shrugged. He said, "That's what they wrote." I felt a ripple move through the gallery. People shifted in their seats. I heard someone whisper. I leaned forward slightly. "That's what they wrote?" I repeated. He nodded. "Yeah, but it's not a big deal." Not a big deal. I remember thinking about the elderly veteran who had just stood there apologizing for a broken tail light. I thought about the young mother who was worried about a $50 fine. And here stood this young man treating reckless driving like a parking ticket. I said, "According to this report, you were driving 90 miles per hour in a residential zone." He gave a half smile. "It was late." I stared at him for a moment. "Late doesn't make children invisible," I said quietly. He shifted his weight and rolled his neck like he was loosening up before a workout. That told me something. He wasn't nervous. He was irritated. I asked him, "Do you understand the seriousness of these charges?" He looked at me directly and said, "With all due respect, Your Honor, this is being blown out of proportion." With all due respect. I've heard that phrase thousands of times. Most of the time, what follows has nothing to do with respect. I folded my hands together on the bench. "Explain to me," I said calmly, "how driving 90 miles per hour through a neighborhood is being blown out of proportion." He let out a short laugh. I heard it echo off the wood panels. "Because nobody got hurt." Nobody got hurt. I felt my jaw tighten just slightly. I didn't raise my voice. I never do, unless I absolutely have to. But I let the silence sit there. Silence can be powerful. I said, "So in your mind, the only time something is wrong is when someone ends up in the hospital?" He didn't answer right away. He just stared at me. That stare again. Not angry, not afraid, challenging. I've seen that look before. Usually from someone who's never faced real consequences. Christina shifted beside me. I could sense her tension. She's been with me long enough to know when a case is turning. I said, "There's also a note here that you refused to step out of the vehicle when instructed by the officer." He raised his eyebrows slightly. I asked why. "That's not what the report says," I replied. He shrugged again. "Look, I wasn't disrespectful. I just wanted to know why I was being stopped." I nodded slowly. "You were being stopped because you were driving 90 miles per hour. He opened his mouth like he was about to argue again, then stopped. I saw frustration flicker across his face. For the first time, a small crack in the confidence. I asked him, "Are you employed?" He hesitated. "Yeah." "Where?" He shifted his feet. "Family business." I remember thinking, of course. I glanced back at the file and then said carefully, "And your father is?" There it was, the moment. He didn't hesitate this time. His posture straightened. His chin lifted just a little higher. "My father is the chief of police." There was an audible murmur in the courtroom. I heard someone inhale sharply. I didn't react outwardly. But inside, I understood what he had just done. He had laid down what he thought was a shield. I've been on this bench too long to be impressed by titles. I looked at him and said evenly, "That's his position. I'm asking about yours." His jaw tightened. He said, "I work with him sometimes." I nodded. "So you understand the law?" He didn't answer. I leaned forward slightly and said something I've said many times before. I've learned one thing in 40 years. The law doesn't care about your last name. It cares about your actions. He rolled his eyes. Actually rolled his eyes. I heard someone in the gallery whisper, "Wow." I had to take a slow breath. I could feel my blood pressure rising just a little. Not because he mentioned his father, but because of the attitude, the dismissal. I said, "Young man, this is a court of law, not a social club." He let out another short laugh and said, "You're acting like I committed a felony." I removed my glasses and rubbed my eyes for a moment. I do that when I'm choosing my words carefully. Then I looked directly at him and said, "You drove at a speed that could have killed someone. You refused an officer's instruction, and now you're standing here minimizing it. That concerns me." He leaned closer to the podium and lowered his voice slightly, but I could still hear it clearly. He said, "With all due respect, you don't know who you're talking to." The room went completely silent. I felt the tension hit like a wave. I stood up from my bench. I rarely do that, but sometimes a physical shift is necessary. I didn't slam the gavel. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood. And I said very calmly, "I know exactly who I'm talking to. I'm talking to a young man who believes his father's badge is a substitute for his own character. You could have heard a pin drop." His face flushed slightly, red creeping up his neck. He said, louder this time, "I'm saying this shouldn't even be a case. One phone call and this disappears." There it was. The assault wasn't physical, not yet, but it was direct. It was aimed at the integrity of my courtroom. I felt something settle inside me, a firmness, not anger, clarity. I said, "Are you threatening this court with influence?" He shook his head quickly. "I'm just stating facts." I leaned forward and placed both hands on the bench. "I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you," I said. "Money can buy a lot of things. Power can open a lot of doors. But it cannot buy your way above the law, not in my courtroom." His jaw clenched. For the first time, I saw something else in his eyes. Not arrogance, defiance. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about a speeding ticket. This was about something deeper. This was about a young man who had never once been told that his name didn't matter. I could feel the air in the room getting heavier, and I had a strong feeling that this conversation was about to move beyond words. I stayed standing for a moment longer than usual. Sometimes silence forces a person to hear themselves. I've used it for decades. I let it stretch just enough to make him uncomfortable. Or at least I hoped it would. He didn't look uncomfortable. He looked irritated. I slowly sat back down and folded my hands again. I said, "Let's reset this conversation. I'm going to ask you directly. Do you take responsibility for driving at 90 miles per hour in a residential neighborhood?" He exhaled sharply through his nose. "I already told you it was late." "That's not what I asked," I replied. He glanced back toward the gallery. I followed his eyes. 2 young men sat there, watching him like this was entertainment. One of them smirked. I've seen that dynamic before. Pride grows louder when it has an audience. He turned back to me and said, "Fine, I was speeding. Happy?" I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, disappointment. I said, "This isn't about my happiness. This is about public safety." He tapped his fingers on the podium. Tap, 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 impatient, almost annoyed that I was taking this seriously. I remember thinking about my father again. He used to say, "Frank, arrogance is loud, but accountability whispers." Right now, there was no whisper. I said, "When the officer asked you to step out of the vehicle, why did you refuse?" He tilted his head slightly. "Because I didn't feel like I needed to." The room shifted again. I heard someone in the back mutter, "Unbelievable." I leaned forward and said, "When an officer gives you a lawful command, you comply. That's not optional." He crossed his arms. "It is when they're targeting you." I paused. That was new. "Targeting you?" I asked. "Yeah," he said quickly. "You know how this works. People see my last name and they want to make an example." I held his gaze. "Are you suggesting the officer pulled you over because of who your father is?" He hesitated just long enough for me to see he hadn't expected that question. "I'm just saying," he continued, "this stuff happens." I nodded slowly. "The dash camera footage is attached to this file. It shows you accelerating away from a traffic light at a high rate of speed." He didn't respond. "And it shows the officer activating lights and sirens," I added. "It also shows you continuing for nearly half a mile before pulling over." He clenched his jaw. I didn't see him right away. "I imagine the flashing lights were difficult to miss," I said calmly. He stepped back slightly from the podium, then leaned in again. I could see the frustration building. His control was slipping just a little. "You're making this bigger than it is," he snapped. There it was, the first crack in the composure. I said quietly, "You made it bigger when you chose to drive that way." He looked down at the bench, then back at me. His eyes were sharper now, colder. "You know," he said, lowering his voice, "my dad won't be happy about this." I felt the temperature in the room drop. I've been threatened before, directly and indirectly. Most judges have. It comes with the robe. But this wasn't just a threat. It was an attempt at leverage. I said very evenly, "Your father's feelings have no bearing on the law." He smirked again. "You sure about that?" I heard Christina shift beside me. I could sense the courtroom holding its breath. I removed my glasses again and placed them carefully on the bench. "I'm absolutely sure," I said. He suddenly stepped around the side of the podium, closer to the bench than protocol allows. It wasn't violent, not yet, but it was aggressive. The bailiff immediately moved slightly forward. I raised my hand gently to signal him to wait. I said, "Return to the podium." He didn't move. Instead, he leaned forward, palms pressed against the wood barrier, and said, "You're treating me like I'm some criminal." I stood again, this time more firmly. "I am treating you like every other defendant who stands in front of me," I said. His voice rose. "No, you're not." Gasps filled the room. Someone whispered, "Sit down." He took another half step forward. Now the bailiff moved decisively, placing himself slightly between us, and that's when it happened. He pointed at me, not wildly, not screaming, but pointed. "You don't get to disrespect my family like this," he said. The words hung there. I felt something shift inside me, not fear, not anger, resolve. I said very slowly, "I have not disrespected your family. I have asked you to respect the law." He shook his head. "You're enjoying this." Enjoying it. In 40 years, I have never enjoyed disciplining someone, especially someone young. I felt my heart beat steady, years of experience settling over me like armor. I leaned slightly forward and said something I rarely say with this level of firmness. In my courtroom, a nurse and a millionaire stand on exactly the same ground, and that's how it should be. His face flushed deeper. "You're making a mistake," he muttered. I heard it clearly, and this time I didn't let it pass quietly. "Are you threatening this court?" I asked directly. He scoffed. "I'm stating facts." Before I could respond, the courtroom doors behind him opened, the heavy wooden doors. Slowly, every head in the room turned. I saw the shift immediately in his posture. The confidence returned. The shoulders straightened. He didn't even look back at first. He just smiled slightly. That told me everything. I turned my eyes toward the entrance, and I saw a uniform, high-ranking, decorated. The chief of police himself stepped into my courtroom. The room went completely silent. I watched the young man's smirk widen just slightly. He whispered under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear, "Told you." I didn't react outwardly, but inside I understood what everyone in that room was expecting. They were expecting protection. They were expecting influence. They were expecting this entire situation to dissolve. I felt my father's voice again in my memory. "Frank, real character shows when it costs you something." The chief walked forward slowly. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't panicked. It was unreadable. He stopped about 10 feet behind his son, and in that moment I realized this day was about to test more than just one young man's ego. It was about to test a father, and possibly an entire system. I took a slow breath, because whatever happened next was going to define more than a speeding ticket. I kept my eyes on the chief for a long moment. He didn't look at me first. He looked at his son. And I watched something pass between them, not words, not gestures, just a look. A father measuring his child, a leader measuring a mistake. The young man straightened his jacket and stepped slightly to the side, almost proudly. "Dad," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "this is getting blown out of proportion." There was that phrase again, blown out of proportion. I didn't speak. I wanted to see how this would unfold without my interference. The chief finally shifted his eyes toward me. "We've known each other professionally for years. We've stood at community events together. We've shaken hands at ceremonies. We've disagreed respectfully on policy. But I had never seen his face look like that. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment carved deep. He nodded once at me, not friendly, not hostile, just acknowledgement. Then he looked back at his son. "What happened?" he asked quietly. His son gestured toward me with an open palm. "He's acting like I committed some huge crime. It was just speeding." I saw the chief's jaw tighten slightly. "Were you speeding?" he asked. His son hesitated for half a second. "Just half." "Yeah, but 90 miles per hour?" The chief interrupted. Silence. The young man didn't answer. The chief turned toward me. "Is that accurate, Your Honor?" I met his gaze. "According to the dash cam footage and the officer's report, yes." The chief inhaled slowly. I could see his chest rise under his uniform. Years of discipline held in that breath. "And did you refuse to step out of the vehicle?" he asked his son. His son shifted again. "I asked questions." "That's not what I asked," the chief said, firmer now. The room felt frozen. I watched the young man's confidence flicker. Not gone, but shaken. "I didn't think it was necessary," he muttered. The chief closed his eyes briefly, just for a second. When he opened them again, they weren't the eyes of a father. They were the eyes of a law enforcement officer. "Step back," he said. His son blinked. "What?" "Step back from the bench, now." The command wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The young man took a small step back, confusion flashing across his face. "Dad, come on," he said under his breath. "We don't need to do this." I felt the air shift again. I said nothing. The chief turned fully toward me. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "may I address the court?" "You may," I replied. He stepped forward slightly, standing beside his son, but not touching him. "I've served this city for 32 years, he began. "I've asked officers under my command to hold strangers accountable for their actions. I've stood at podiums and told this community that the law applies to everyone." He paused. "And that includes my family." There was a ripple in the gallery. The young man's head snapped toward him. "Dad, enough," the chief said sharply. I saw it then. The realization. The young man had walked in expecting a shield. Instead, he was facing a mirror. The chief looked at me again. "Your Honor, if my son violated the law, I expect him to face the same consequences as anyone else." I felt something heavy settle in my chest. I've been on this bench long enough to recognize integrity when I see it, and integrity often costs something. The young man's voice rose. "Are you serious right now?" The chief didn't look at him. "Yes," he said simply. His son laughed in disbelief. "You're going to let him do this over a speeding ticket?" The chief finally turned toward him fully. "This isn't about a ticket," he said quietly. "It's about respect." The word hung in the air. Respect. I thought about my father again. The way he used to remove his hat when he entered any building. The way he spoke softly to people older than him. The way he taught me that authority wasn't a crown. It was a responsibility. The young man shook his head. "You're embarrassing me." The chief's voice lowered. "No, you embarrassed yourself." I watched the young man's face change. The arrogance was cracking now, pride turning into anger. I met his gaze. "According to the dash cam footage and the officer's report, yes." The chief inhaled slowly. I could see his chest rise under his uniform, years of discipline held in that breath. "You always care more about your badge than your family," he snapped. The room gasped. I felt the tension spike. The chief didn't flinch. "I care about the example I set," he replied. "For you, for every officer under my command, for this city." His son looked around the courtroom, realizing every eye was on him. "This is ridiculous," he said, stepping backward again. "This is a joke." He turned toward the gallery like he was looking for support, but the smirks were gone. The whispers had stopped. He was alone. I leaned forward slightly and said calmly, "Young man, I have not yet issued any ruling. Your behavior in this courtroom will factor into my decision." He glared at me, and then he said something that changed everything. "You think you're untouchable up there," he said. "You're just a judge in a small courtroom. My father runs this city." The words echoed, and for the first time I saw something in the chief's face that wasn't disappointment. It was pain, deep and immediate. He turned slowly toward his son. "Take that back," he said quietly. His son didn't. Instead, he crossed his arms again. That was the moment. The chief reached to his shoulder radio. I felt the room hold its breath. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He said 2 words. Officer inside. 2 uniformed officers entered from the side door within seconds. The young man blinked in confusion. What are you doing? The chief's voice didn't waver. Place him in restraints. The courtroom erupted in whispers. What? His son shouted. You can't be serious. The chief looked directly at him and said something I will never forget. No one is above the law, not even my blood. I felt chills run down my arms. The officer stepped forward carefully, not aggressively, but firmly. The young man pulled back. Dad, stop. The chief didn't move. He stood there as they guided his son's hands behind his back. I heard the sound, the metallic click of handcuffs. It echoed louder than any gavel I've ever struck. The young man's face drained of color. The arrogance was gone now, completely. Dad, he said again, softer this time, but the chief's eyes were fixed forward, not on me, not on the crowd, somewhere beyond all of it. I remained standing. I had witnessed many arrests in my courtroom, but I had never witnessed a father order the arrest of his own son. The young man looked at me one last time. There was no challenge in his eyes now, only shock and something else, fear. And in that moment, I realized this day had just crossed into something none of us would ever forget. I watched as the officers gently but firmly guided him a few steps to the side. They didn't drag him, they didn't push him, but the sound of those cuffs had already done the work. The entire courtroom felt different now. The arrogance that had filled the air just minutes earlier had vanished. He wasn't fighting anymore. He wasn't smirking. He was breathing fast. Dad, please, he said, his voice lower now. Not loud, not bold, just uncertain. I saw the chief close his eyes for a second, just a second, a father fighting something inside himself. But when he opened them again, he didn't waver. This isn't about humiliation, he said quietly. This is about accountability. I stayed standing behind my bench. I didn't rush to speak. Moments like that deserve space. The weight of them needs room to settle. The young man looked at me again. There was no defiance left, but there was anger. You're enjoying this, he said to me. I felt something tighten in my chest, not offense, not satisfaction, sadness. I take no pleasure in this, I replied calmly. I take responsibility. He shook his head slightly, almost in disbelief. You could have just fined me, he said. Yes, I answered. I could have. That was the truth. If he had walked in respectfully, if he had shown even a trace of humility, if he had accepted responsibility when I first asked, this would have ended very differently. I stepped down from the bench. I rarely do that. But this was no longer just paperwork and procedure. This was about something bigger. The courtroom was silent as I walked slowly toward the front of the bench area. I didn't approach him aggressively. I kept a respectful distance. I said, "Look at me." He hesitated. Then he did. For 40 years, I continued, I have watched young men stand where you're standing, some with far less opportunity than you, some who never had a father present, some who never had guidance. I paused. You had every advantage. His jaw trembled slightly, just a little. I wasn't hurting anyone, he muttered. You were gambling with lives, I said gently, and when you were confronted, you gambled with integrity. He swallowed. I turned slightly toward the gallery, then back to him. I told you something earlier, I said. Money can buy a lot of things. Power can open doors, but it cannot buy character. His eyes dropped to the floor. The chief stood only a few feet away. He hadn't moved. His posture was straight, but I could see the tension in his hands. I looked at the chief for a moment. You've built a career on enforcing the law, I said to him, and today you've upheld it. He nodded once. No pride, no relief, just gravity. I returned my focus to the young man. This court does not punish out of anger, I said. It corrects behavior. He looked back up at me, eyes slightly wet now, not crying, but close. I didn't think it was a big deal, he admitted quietly. That was the first honest sentence he had spoken all morning. I leaned forward slightly. That, I said softly, is the problem. The room was still silent. Even the air conditioning hum felt distant. I felt my father's words echo again in my mind. Respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. I straightened up. Here is what is going to happen, I said clearly. His shoulders stiffened. You will be held in contempt for your conduct in this courtroom. He closed his eyes briefly. You will face the original charges as filed. He nodded slightly. And, I continued, you will complete 100 hours of community service, not in an office, not behind a desk, but working alongside officers who patrol the neighborhoods you treated like a racetrack. He looked surprised. That's not, he started. That's not optional, I finished calmly. I turned to the chief. I trust your department will assign him accordingly. The chief responded immediately. Yes, Your Honor. The young man let out a slow breath. The fight had drained out of him. I wasn't finished. You will also attend a driver responsibility course, I added, and you will return to this courtroom in 90 days to report your progress. He nodded again. And if I hear even a whisper of further misconduct, I said firmly, the consequences will escalate. He swallowed hard. Yes, sir, he whispered. Sir. It was the first time he had addressed me with respect all morning. I studied his face carefully. I've learned to watch for performance, for fake remorse. But what I saw wasn't acting, it was realization. The officers loosened their grip slightly but kept the cuffs in place. The chief finally stepped closer to his son. I'll handle the paperwork, he said quietly. His son didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead. I stepped back toward my bench slowly. Each step felt deliberate. Before I returned fully behind it, I stopped and said one more thing. I want you to understand something, I said to the young man. Today is not about destroying your future. It's about protecting it. He blinked quickly. You were headed down a path that ends in entitlement and isolation, I continued. Today might be the first time someone forced you to confront that. He nodded faintly. I returned to my seat and picked up the gavel. I didn't slam it. I never do. Court will stand in brief recess, I announced. As the room began to stir, I felt something inside me settle. Justice is not revenge. It's correction. Before the officers escorted him out, he turned slightly toward his father. I didn't think you'd actually do it, he said quietly. The chief's voice was steady. Neither did I, he replied. That sentence lingered in the air long after they exited. I remained seated for a moment after the courtroom cleared. Christina approached quietly. You handled that well, she said softly. I shook my head slightly. I didn't handle it alone, I replied, because the truth is, the most powerful moment in that courtroom didn't come from me. It came from a father who chose principle over pride. Let me pause here and ask you something. If you were in that chief's position, could you have made that call? Could you have chosen the law over your own child in front of an entire courtroom? I genuinely want to know what you think. Leave me a comment. These conversations matter. I looked down at the file again. This case wasn't over, not legally, not emotionally, because I had a strong feeling that what happened in that courtroom today would echo far beyond those wooden walls, and I wasn't wrong. When the courtroom emptied and the doors finally closed, I didn't move right away. I stayed seated behind my bench, hands folded, staring at the wood grain in front of me. The room that had been full of tension just minutes earlier now felt almost hollow. The echoes of raised voices were gone, replaced by a heavy silence. I've learned over the years that the loudest moments in a courtroom aren't always the ones with shouting. Sometimes it's what comes after. Christina stepped closer and said softly, The chief is asking if he may speak with you in chambers. I nodded. Send him in. I removed my robe slowly before walking back. I always do that before private conversations. The robe represents authority, but man to man, sometimes you need to speak without it. When he entered my chambers, he didn't look like the police chief of Providence. He looked like a tired father. He closed the door behind him and stood there for a second, hands at his sides. I could see the weight pressing down on him now that the audience was gone. Frank, he said quietly. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. Sit. He sat down heavily. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I could hear the faint hum of the courthouse air system. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. I didn't know he was coming to court today, he finally said. I figured, I replied. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. I got a call from one of my officers when he started raising his voice, he continued. By the time I walked in, I already knew it wasn't going well. I studied his face. The confidence he carried in uniform had faded. In its place was something raw. I didn't walk in to rescue him, he said firmly, but I won't lie. For a split second, I wanted to. I appreciated the honesty. That's natural, I told him. You're his father. He shook his head slowly. I've spent 32 years telling young officers that integrity matters more than loyalty, that the badge means nothing if it protects wrongdoing. He looked up at me. But when it's your own blood, he said quietly, it feels different. I leaned back slightly in my chair. My father used to tell me, I began, that the hardest choices are the ones that cost you something. He nodded. It cost you something today, I added. He let out a slow breath. He'll never forget it. Good, I said gently. He blinked, surprised by my tone. Painful lessons are often the ones that stick, I explained. If you had shielded him, what would he have learned? He didn't answer right away. That he's untouchable, he finally admitted. I nodded. And what happens to untouchable men? I asked. He looked away. They eventually fall harder. Exactly. I stood and walked toward the small window in my chambers. From there, I could see part of the courthouse steps outside. Reporters had already started gathering. Word travels fast in a city like this. He used your name like it was armor, I said quietly. The chief's jaw tightened. I know, he replied. That's not on you, I added. But how you responded is. He looked up at me again. You think I did the right thing? He asked. I turned back toward him. I think you did the hard thing, I said, and most people don't. He rubbed his hands together slowly. He's not a bad kid, he said. He just grew up hearing people say yes. I sat back down across from him. Yes can be dangerous, I said. He gave a faint, tired smile. You have no idea how many doors opened for him just because of my position. I do have an idea, I replied. I saw it in his eyes this morning. We sat in silence for a moment. Do you think he understood? He asked quietly. Not fully, I answered honestly, but he felt it. The chief nodded. He's never been handcuffed before, he said. That's why it mattered, I replied. He swallowed hard. I saw his face when they put the cuffs on, he said. It hit him. Yes, I said. It did. I leaned forward slightly. Let me ask you something, I said. He looked at me. If you had walked in and pulled him out of there, what would the officers in that courtroom have thought? He didn't hesitate this time. They would have lost respect for me. And what would your son have thought? I pressed. He looked down again. That he can always hide behind me. I nodded slowly. You didn't just protect the law today, I said. You protected him from becoming something worse. His eyes were glossy now, though he tried to hide it. I don't want him to resent me, he admitted. He might, I said honestly. For a while. He exhaled deeply. But resentment fades, I continued. Character lasts. The clock ticked again in the quiet room. "I'll make sure he completes every hour of that service," he said firmly. "I don't doubt it," I replied. He stood up slowly. Before he reached the door, he stopped and turned back. "Frank," he said, voice lower now, "thank you." "For what?" I asked. "For not backing down." I met his eyes. "That's my job," I said. After he left, I remained in my chair for a long time. I thought about the young man's face when he realized the shield wasn't coming. I thought about the metallic click of the cuffs. And I thought about my own grandson. What kind of father do I want him to see me be? Let me ask you something here. Have you ever had to make a decision that hurt someone you love because it was the right thing to do? I'm curious. Those choices define us more than the easy ones. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. I finally stood up and walked back toward the courtroom. Cases were still waiting. Life doesn't pause for personal reflection. The docket keeps moving, but as I put my robe back on, I felt something settle inside me. Justice had been served, not perfectly, not cleanly, but honestly. And sometimes honesty is the most powerful sentence a courtroom can deliver. What I didn't know yet was that this story wasn't finished, because 90 days later, that young man would walk back into my courtroom, and the look in his eyes would be completely different. 90 days passed faster than I expected. Court calendars have a way of moving life along whether you're ready or not. Cases stack up, stories overlap, faces blur together, but every once in a while, there's a name on the docket that you don't forget. When I saw his name scheduled for review, I paused. I remembered the sound of the cuffs. I remembered the look on his father's face, and I wondered which version of him would walk back into my courtroom. That morning, I arrived at 8:15 sharp, just like always. Christina had my coffee waiting, strong, black, the same way I've taken it for 40 years. "You thinking about today's review?" she asked gently. "I am," I admitted. She gave me a small smile. "I heard he's been showing up early for his community hours." I nodded but didn't respond. I've learned not to judge a transformation before I see it with my own eyes. When I stepped onto the bench, the courtroom was steady, calm, routine. Then Christina called his name. He stood up from the second row this time, not the back. No expensive jacket, no smirk, no phone in his hand. Just a simple button-down shirt and eyes that didn't scan the room for approval. I watched him walk to the podium. His steps were slower now, measured. He stopped, looked up at me, and said, "Good morning, Your Honor." The tone was different, respectful. I felt something small but noticeable shift inside me. "Good morning," I replied. I glanced at the report in front of me. 100 hours of community service completed. Driver responsibility course finished. No new violations. I looked back at him. "How did it go?" I asked. He took a breath before answering. "At first," he said honestly, "I was angry. That didn't surprise me. I thought it was unfair," he continued. "I thought you and my dad were trying to make an example out of me." I nodded slightly. "And now?" He hesitated. "Now I think I needed it." The room was quiet. He swallowed and continued. "They assigned me to ride along with traffic patrol," he said. "I saw what reckless driving actually does." His voice tightened slightly. "I saw a car wrapped around a pole, a family inside, a kid about my cousin's age in the back seat." He paused. "They survived," he added quickly, "but barely." I felt the weight of that image settle over the room. "I kept thinking," he said softly, "that could have been me, or someone I hit." There was no arrogance left, just realization. "I also had to direct traffic outside a school for 2 weeks," he continued. "Kids crossing the street every morning." He shook his head slightly. "I never thought about how fast 90 miles per hour actually is until I stood there watching them." I leaned forward slightly. "What did you learn?" I asked. He looked at me directly. "That my last name doesn't slow a car down," he said, "and it doesn't protect anyone." I felt something warm settle in my chest. He continued, I used my dad's position like it was a shield. I thought it meant I didn't have to listen. He took another breath. And when he didn't step in, that hurt. The honesty in his voice was clear. But I get it now, he added. He wasn't choosing the badge over me. He was choosing who he wants me to become. I glanced briefly toward the gallery. The chief was sitting there quietly, not in uniform this time, just a father watching. He didn't move. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. I turned back to the young man. Why do you think I stood up that day? I asked him. He thought for a second. Because I stepped too far, he said. Yes, I replied. But also because I wanted you to see something. He waited. I wanted you to see that authority doesn't shout, I said. It stands firm. He nodded slowly. I was trying to intimidate you, he admitted. And you didn't flinch. I gave a faint smile. I've had 40 years of practice, I said. A small ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room. Then I grew serious again. You embarrassed yourself that day, I said calmly, but embarrassment can be a teacher. He nodded. I'm sorry, he said, not loudly, not dramatically, just sincerely. I studied his face carefully. In 40 years, I've seen fake apologies. I've seen rehearsed regret. This wasn't that. This was earned. I leaned back slightly and said, apology accepted. He exhaled slowly, like he had been holding that breath for 3 months. I looked toward the chief briefly. He was blinking rapidly, trying not to show too much emotion. Then I turned back to the young man. I'm going to close this case today, I said. No further penalties. Relief flickered across his face, but I raised a finger gently. But understand something. He straightened. Respect isn't something you inherit, I said. It's something you build every single day. Yes, sir, he replied. Sir again. I picked up my gavel and brought it down gently. Case closed. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried. As he stepped away from the podium, he turned toward his father. For a brief second, they just looked at each other. Then the chief stood and placed a hand on his son's shoulder, not as a shield, as a guide. After the courtroom cleared, I remained seated for a moment. I thought about my father, the immigrant who taught me that dignity isn't about power. It's about restraint. I thought about the chief choosing principle over pride, and I thought about that young man who walked in 90 days ago believing he was untouchable. Transformation doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes with handcuffs. Let me ask you something. So let me ask you this. Do you think I was too harsh on her or not harsh enough? I'm genuinely curious what you think. And here's another question for you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have shown mercy or delivered justice? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. If this story meant something to you, if you believe in equal justice like I do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, someone who believes that character matters more than cash. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another incredible story from my courtroom that you won't believe. I'll see you tomorrow with another lesson about justice, respect, and what really matters in this life. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law, every single one of us, rich or poor, powerful or powerless. That's what makes this country work. Thank you for listening to my story. God bless you, and remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything.